Knowledge in crisis.
The podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Knowledge in Crisis podcast. We're here today with two of my friends and colleagues. We, that is Gregor Greslehner and Matt Dougherty. And our guest today is Sophie Veigl from the University of Vienna. She is a philosopher of science with also a background training in biology, immunology specifically. Why don't you tell us a bit more about your background to begin with?
Yeah, hi you two. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. As you already said, I'm Sophie. I'm a philosopher of science, dabbling in epistemology as well. And yes, I'm also a trained biologist. So I did biology for my undergrad and master's degree. And then I transitioned into philosophy. While I was doing my master's in biology, I also took some courses in the history and philosophy of science, and I really liked it. I think there are also some structural reasons, right? Like humanities studies are often smaller and you have way more chances to interact with professors. And for me, it was the first time I was always doing sort of well in biology, but no one said it. And when I started going to this history and philosophy classes, I had so much feedback from professors and teachers, and I really liked it. And then I applied for a doctoral program called The Sciences in Historical, Philosophical and Cultural Contexts. And yeah, I got in and I never looked back.
Very nice. So Sophie, we know that you do a fair bit of research on objectivity and the issue of objectivity. So we want to talk a bit about that. But we also wanted to hear, first of all, about whether you think that there's a crisis of knowledge in your field or subfields.
I would say, to me, there are a lot of structural problems within academic philosophy. If you look at the professorial ranks, at the postdoc ranks, and so on and so forth, we don't have a lot of diversity. And there are reasons why that is, right? Because if you look at the University of Vienna, we have bachelor courses with such diverse students, right? So many non-male students, gender non-conforming people, people with migration biographies, and they vanish at a certain point. And I think, of course, life happens, but there are certain reasons why life happens differently to different people. And I think as philosophers, we don't do enough to keep philosophy more diverse. And I would say having a diversity, people from different background in philosophy also enriches the thinking. And I think that's already a link to the topic of objectivity. So I think philosophy can still be very monolithic and very much insisting on the big words like objectivity, rationality, and so on and so forth. And by that, disqualifying other ways of doing philosophy, more political ways of doing philosophy, more activist way of doing philosophy that is done around the world and not in the global north. I don't know whether I would call this a crisis, but a problem in philosophy. But I also think this affects how we look at the crisis in knowledge in more general. Because maybe the ways we think about objectivity, rationality, the status of science is a bit contorted with regards to what science really is. And I think philosophy could be a stronger voice with regards to exposing that, science doesn't deliver truth as a product, but it is a particular process that is reliable, but also has its weaknesses. And I think if that would be better communicated, people wouldn't take certain happenings within science, finding out big pharma funds certain things, finding out people disagree as such a sign of something wrong within science. As a second aspect, I also think that we often overlook certain reasons why people start distrusting science, or the ways institutionalized science has wronged a lot of marginalized peoples for hundreds of years. Still, when women go to the doctor, when people of color go to the doctor, they are less believed. And I think that's a constant erosion of trust. And we should also look at these reasons and not just ask, why are people so stupid, right?
Great, there's a lot of interesting things here to go into. So first of all, what you just described really sounds like a structural problem that we have in the philosophical institutions and also the scientific ones. That also translates then into methodological and theoretical issues that arise from these structural issues. Could you say a bit more about how the interplay between philosophy and science could help to ameliorate some of these problems? Do you see that people are open to acknowledge that these problems exist, and what the steps should be to rectify those?
That's a difficult question because I would have to say very general things about a lot of people. I do think that particularly within the philosophy of science, for example, people seem to be quite open. There's like an ever-growing field called the philosophy of science in practice, which really emphasizes, the processes that are important in scientific knowledge making and don't focus on the products in a way of science, but it's rather about how is knowledge produced and also how can we open up these knowledge producing processes for other people to also trace them better, understand them better, make science maybe, a bit more vulnerable, but also something people can relate to better. With regards to the sciences, I would say that really depends, right? I know scientists who are amazing, who are very critical, who I think do a great job of really presenting science as it is, as a process that is faulty, that is problematic, that has a particular political history. But on the other hand, you so often see people as the representatives of science at certain public events in television and so on and so forth. And they still often speak like, the Pope. And that's an important historical connection, right? Because institutionalized science, as we know it today, was fashioned after, in a way, Catholicism. And of course, Catholicism has an appeal to absolute truth. So that works for them, right? They have God and the Bible. We don't have it like that, but we still had these appeals to producing truths and facts and so on and so forth. So I think that's still a big, strong rhetoric and narrative for scientists. When I grew up as a molecular biologist, I was also raised within this narrative. So I would say there might still be a problem with regards to practicing natural scientists of how they present their discipline. Well, sometimes, of course, understanding why they do it. When it's about coronavirus and keeping people healthy, of course, you don't want to be, well, it's a process. You want to say you should do that, right?
So what you were just saying made me think back to something that you said earlier. So we have this idea of absolute truth, and often objectivity is pretty directly connected to that. We think that only if it's absolutely true is it objective, or at least absolutely true right now is it objective. Earlier you said that you're very interested in looking at objectivity from people's perspectives, that you think that certain perspectives have more insight perhaps into certain topics and phenomena. And I was wondering how you think we should think about squaring these things, because along with absolute truth, sometimes objectivity is thought to go with lack of perspective, the absolute or non-standpoint. Whereas you seem very interested in thinking, well, no, we only have objectivity from a perspective and we have to recognize that. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think something that you mentioned already is this view from nowhere, right? You have a view from nowhere, and that way you can achieve this kind of objectivity. What you observe is not hampered by any interest, any positionality, any politics. There is no human factor even in the ways you could generate knowledge that is objective. In my opinion, science is an intellectual activity done by humans in a lot of different places with a lot of different needs and interests and biases. Turning towards acknowledging that's a big part of feminist standpoint epistemology, that we can give up this view from nowhere perspective, because who should attain it? But we can say who has a good position to talk about certain things, while acknowledging that, of course, these things are happening within a particular situatedness, but still there are particular situations that privilege you to say something about a certain situation. I think that's a very interesting perspective on thinking about who can give us a helpful view on the world, a helpful view on a particular problem that also helps us to take particular actions. Often we talk only about their knowledge and their facts and their objectivity. But in the end, science does want to do something with the world. It does want to address certain problems. I think a focus towards which types of knowledges give us the right tools to address certain situations is a very important shift in focus of who has an interesting, privileged perspectives on certain issues.
So in thinking about this kind of perspectival notion of objectivity within the sciences, do you think that this is more or less the same for each of the sciences? Because one might think that, say, physics is less perspectival than biology, which is less perspectival than social sciences, etc., and you might think that there's a kind of gradient of objectivity in the traditional sense of objectivity within these sciences.
That's a very interesting question, and I actually often discuss this also with students when we come to topics of objectivity. I don't have a definite answer, but I have certain intuitions that I think counter a very categorical, biology yes and physics no kind of view, but would embrace a certain gradual view at least. One point is the contingency of how disciplines emerge, right? The conglomerates we now can identify as this is biology and this is physics. There's no necessity in these disciplines researching exactly these types of things. So I think because there is such a contingency with regards to how scientific disciplines develop, I think very easily maybe a particular discipline that we now look at as more instrumental, that is more catering to certain human needs, might have in a different world also included certain things about physics that we now wouldn't relate with something that biologists could investigate. So I think because of this contingency, I cannot have a very categorical answer. And my second intuition about that is regards numbers, right? Because if you look at these different disciplines, you certainly, for example, have more women practicing biology than physics. And you also have more feminist philosophy of biology than feminist philosophy of physics. This is not only because physics just doesn't lend itself towards these things, but it also has something to do with entrance criteria. Also a lot of studies why a lot of women and people of color stop studying this, and it's not because they can't do it, but because, the structural aspect. So I would be interesting to see, in an alternative world where we would have like different numbers and different types of people in different disciplines, I would expect this to be a little bit different. There is, for example, a feminist critique of chemistry that says that gendered stereotypes are present in the way that certain chemical reactions are described. So I think that's very interesting, and if we can make a feminist analysis of very basic organic chemistry reactions, maybe we can also do this for physics.
Is it also related to this ideal that one should or could separate the knower, the subject, from the object, the thing that knowledge is about, that just doesn't work in many of the less objective sciences that some people would claim that often rely much more about the interplay of the knower and the object, and that might not straightforwardly be so obvious to someone doing classical hardcore physics in the traditional way. The very same principles do apply there nonetheless.
I think that's a very interesting thought, and particularly thinking about the social sciences, it's like a big methodological doctrine that you're not separated from your object of study, right? There are human beings, you make interviews, you observe them, you interact with them, you also make a change in how they think. Participatory research even demands you for them to actively, contribute to the questions you're asking and maybe also reshaping these questions. So in these disciplines, you have a very active methodological reflection on the interactions between the one who has the research grant and the people who are being studied. And I think you're right, you can make this point about many other study object and investigator relations, but it's not part of the methodological tool set of certain disciplines to start reflecting upon this. I think very often it happens that doing this kind of reflections in disciplines where this is not the usual often comes with being labeled as even biased. I have a favorite example, which is from evolutionary biology, where I think the story is a couple of queer evolutionary biologists met at a conference and discussed why do people think that the last common ancestor, that organism like millions of years ago that started sexual reproduction, why does it have to be heterosexual, right? Why would that last common ancestor would have only to engage in different sex behaviors? And they wrote a Nature article on exploring, modeling, arguing for why our last common ancestor could also have displayed same-sex behaviors. And I think they did it very nicely, very standpointy, right? Because in their introduction introduction, they write about their own perspective and they write about why this occurred to them because, of course, they are queer. They don't think heterosexuality is the only thing that exists. And so they find it strange why biologists present it to be the only thing that is important in evolutionary sense. And a lot of people responded to this paper as biased because people talked about why they started thinking in this kind of ways. And I think that's a very good example for reactions you generate when, in particular, natural science disciplines, you start displaying this kind of relations between the things you study and yourself.
In these sorts of cases where we have research that's being done from a perspective, and the perspective really informs the research being done, we start to have debates where people are like, oh, you only think that because you are such and such a type of person. You only think that because you're such and such a type of person. Is there something else to fall back on in those sorts of situations other than these perspectives? I mean, obviously, in cases of sciences that, we have some practical end that we want to achieve, perhaps in those cases, but say in evolutionary, evolutionary theory, do you think there's something we can fall back on when we start to throw back and forth to the fact that, oh, you just have that view because this is your perspective?
Well, I think there are 2 points. One is that we should acknowledge that there's not the regular biology and then the political people doing their stuff because of, their biases or standpoints or whatever. I think it's a very important claim of feminist philosophers of science, feminist historians of science, who have shown that most of the sciences of the 19th and 20th century were built on very heteropatriarchal assumptions, right? A lot of biomedicine was done to show why women should stay at home and men should be in politics and all that. So there was never like a neutral way of doing science. There was just a way of doing science of not exposing the type of biases, presuppositions that are present. So I think that's like a very first important point, not to pit like the neutral and the political against each other, but more the explicitly and the not explicitly political. And I think we do better when we are more explicit about, our backgrounds and how we think and why we think a particular theory is interesting and not another. But I think there is more to fall back upon than individuals. So I think the point of standpoint knowledge usually isn't about individuals, but rather about communities who come together and reflect upon their experiences to build something that transcends the individual. And I think in the end, as I said before, science is a particular intellectual activity with a lot of standards. The standards are not set in stone. They're open to change. They will not guarantee this absolute objectivity, but as scientists, we agree to certain ways of doing things and certain things not to do. But with regards to all types of science and also with regards to the political natural sciences, you can still see how they fit these scientific standards of how we do experiments, of how we present our results. So I do think there is something. It's still contingent, it's still intersubjective, but science has built a particular set of rules how we want to conduct ourselves.
What you just said with this emphasis of science as this activity of not just individuals, but really whole communities, one could say if a claim has gone through some rigorous scrutiny by the scientific community, there is something objective about a claim that passes this kind of trial and scrutiny.
I would have a very Popperian intuition with regards to that, and I can't believe that I'm going back to Popper because no one seems to like Popper anymore in the philosophy of science. I do think what you mentioned is so important. It says something about a theory if we have tested it rigorously, if a lot of people have tried to replicate it. I'm not sure whether truth or objectivity is the thing it can approach, but there are a lot of reasons why this should be the basis for our actions. I think a very well tested theory, hypothesis, explanation, we have good reasons to apply this. But I don't think that it brings us closer to objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Maybe coming back a bit again to something that has come up already, and this notion of trusting science. Is that really tied to the point of nowhere view of objectivity, or could we just come up with a different notion of trust that maybe encapsulates what you've been alluring to, that we trust in the best procedures and the best communities trying to achieve not maybe objective truth really, but it's the best we can do and that's trustworthy? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Trust is first and foremost a relationship. There are differences if we want to trust a thermometer or trust a friend, right? If I check the thermometer for 5 times, I don't harm the thermometer. But if a friend tells me something bad happened to her and I ask 5 times, are you really sure? I harm her as an epistemic agent. And I think having this idea of how, you are constantly in multiple relationships with multiple knowers, and these are also trust relationships, should also point us towards certain directions of how maybe institutionalized science can amend its harm trust relationships with the public, because there's really no big fixes that can be sort of accomplished from top down. These are about how we as scientists, as medical professionals, conduct ourselves.
The notion of expertise that has been swinging a kind of in the conversation. Sometimes people are the best experts for how they feel or to give testimony about what goes on with their own bodies, for example. Do you think there is anything about who counts as an expert that relates to the notion of objectivity?
Well, I think there are different aspects of expertise, because usually when we talk about expertise, on the one hand, it's the retention of knowledge, right? If you're an expert, you need to know more about a particular subject than a contrast class. Then it's also about skills, right? It's about doing something with your knowledge. And then it's also a little bit about a service to a community. So maybe we don't call a lonely mathematician in a hut in the woods an expert because they don't lend expertise as a service. That could be like a third criterion. But I think if we have these 3 criteria, we haven't yet said about who can be an expert. Usually we associate the retention of knowledge with the kind of knowledge generated by the objective processes of science. If we think about this first criterion of retaining knowledge just with regards to these particular processes, this would mean that only people within institutionalized science can be expert about a lot of things. A lot of different processes can lead you to the retention of very important knowledge that can be self-experienced, but not only that, there's also a lot of community-generated knowledge. I work in my project on knowledge about testosterone, meaning I interview bodybuilders, wrestlers, but also transmasculine testosterone users, and they build a lot of the knowledge through their community, so not only making their own experiences, but reflecting it through the prism of the values, the things that are important within their community. We cannot really make this strict distinction about expertise only lies within the institutions of science.
One thought that has been in the back of my mind as I've been hearing you talk about objectivity is that I guess it's not a theoretical worry that people might have, but a kind of practical worry. So if scientists are doing their research from some perspective that is going to influence how they're doing their research, that seems to make it much harder for me, as a layperson, depending on what the science is, but generally as a layperson, to know what the scientist knows. So, on this sort of traditional view of expertise in science, the scientist says P, says whatever, and I can therefore believe that P because, they're reliable, they're an expert. Whereas, now it seems like if we have this picture of objectivity that you prefer, then I've got a lot more work to do. Does that seem correct, or is that mistaken that this makes knowing these things harder for the average person?
I think it makes it harder because it takes, a bit of reflecting, a bit about thinking about one's own experiences, thinking about why certain experiences are weird when talking with scientific experts. An example for me is, when I talk to my gynecologist, when he says something, about my internal organs, they are the expert, like that's fine. When they talk to me about working out, I don't think they are. And I know a lot of doctors have a lot of strange ideas about women doing heavy lifting. And I know this because I talk with other women who lift heavy, are in combat sports and so on and so forth. And so I need to, in a way, build my own toolbox of working with scientific expertise whenever I encounter it. And I think I cannot do it alone. It's always my community that helps me in contextualizing what I take as just the expertise I need and what I need to take with a pinch of salt.
So the toolbox, the epistemic toolbox, is really something that not only professional scientists, researchers, knowledge producers of any sort should take seriously, but also for the average person. Let me ask the last question for today, maybe related to what we've just been talking about. If you have any practical advice for our listeners to implement what we've discussed today into their everyday lives.
There are a couple of ideas. One is to abstain from thinking of people who don't trust in science anymore or not as much as before as, stupid and uneducated, because there's like a host of different reasons why that might be. And in a lot of cases, there are very sophisticated critiques of what's going on, and very often this rejection or turning away of science is not science in total, but about very particular aspects where they have very good reasons to do so. So I think being a bit more careful with thinking about this problem is, for me, one big takeaway message. And the second one, of course, is about objectivity and the positionality. And I think there it's important to acknowledge that we all have our positionalities. We can't evade it, and we also can't evade it if we are in a group. So it's not just that individual interests cancel each other out once we are in a big enough group. But I think we can reflect that. We can write this in our papers, as the example of the evolutionary biology paper so beautifully showed. And I think this makes science a much more traceable process that can be a little bit more vulnerable towards the outside, but by that maybe being very inspirational. If you're vulnerable, people have an easier time to fall in love with you. So if science maybe is a bit more vulnerable, more people will fall in love with it.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thanks so much for talking to us today, Sophie.
Thank you so much for the invite. That was so much fun.
This podcast has received funding from the Austrian Science Fund as part of the Knowledge in Crisis project. We're a collaboration of more than 50 philosophers at the University of Graz, the University of Salzburg, the University of Vienna, and are led by Central European University. For more information about our research and details about upcoming public events, visit www.knowledgeincrisis.com. You can also find us on most social media platforms at Knowledge Crisis. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.